Я работаю здесь.
I work here and sometimes show this place to journalists.
Это место. Когда-то в этом
In this
здании
building, the headquarters of the National Socialist Party were located. Right here, there was the office of Hess,
впоследствии Бормана.
the one of Bormann later on, over there by the window.
Видеть фундамент церкви.
You can see the foundation of the church ruined in the days of the beer putsch in 1921. A lot of Nazis started their careers right from this office.
In 1987, at the age of 93, former friend and party deputy of Hitler, Parteigenosse Hess, hung himself at the ancient Spandau prison. Hess had been the single prisoner of the temple for the past 10 years. For the country's allies, it cost $1 million per year to keep him. And the circumstances of his death were not less mysterious than his long but tragic life. Loving Hitler, the fatal flight of Hess. Spring of 1941, Great Britain shudders under Luftwaffe air raids. Coventry is ruined to ashes by a single blow. Midland, the center of British military production, is the subject of a constant bombing. The air alarms are so frequent that every evening the London citizens used to head habitually for the subway without even waiting for another alert warning. U.S. Ambassador Kennedy sends a telegram to President Roosevelt to inform him that it's all over for England. This small island, separated from resources, heavily injured by the war, resists the huge European continent, all working for fascist Germany. On Saturday evening, May 10th, 1941, commander of the Royal Air Force Squadron, member of the British Parliament, Duke of Hamilton, is reported about Messerschmitt 110, German aircraft, discovered not far from the shores of Northumberland. The Duke decides it's an undoubted error, for such an aircraft would have never reached that remote point due to the lack of fuel. Next moment, he receives a new note informing that the aircraft fell down and was burning on the earth. The pilot, calling himself the name of Alfred, is alive. He arrived in England with a special mission and wants to talk exclusively to Duke. As soon as the Duke stepped over the threshold of the cell of the prison, the pilot reminded they had met at the Berlin Olympic Games of 1936. Having felt Hamilton's bewilderment, the pilot declared that he, Minister of Reich Rudolf Hess, arrived with a mission in the name of humanity as truce bearer. The impossible happened. In the absolute secret, Reichsminister Hess, dressed in a Luftwaffe uniform, departed in the direction of England just a few weeks before the invasion of Germany into the Soviet territory. Twice had he to dive into the rescue fog above the North Sea to hide himself from the Royal Air Force Speed firefighters. To avoid anti-aircraft batteries, he flew just several hundred meters above the earth. Having reached the location of the Duke's estate, according to the map, Hess rocketed upward and threw himself out of a completely new Messerschmitt, which got into a spin, then smashed. Lucky to have not broken his neck when landed, he limped to the nearest farmhouse, where he was arrested by the local authorities. Having searched Hess, they found 2 business cards. One card belonged to Karl Haushofer, author of the famous Lebensraum theory about lesser peoples that became a basis for the Hitler's theory of Nazism. The other one was of his son Albert. These two men were from the highest ranks of the German Reich.
The Brits were puzzled when a Luftwaffe officer fell down from the sky right in their hands. The pilot recommended himself Alfred Horm. By the way, his initials AH were the same ones as of Adolf Hitler and Albert Haushofer. I'm not aware of whether it was by chance or not, but there is such a fact.
Rudolf Hess explains the goals of his mission. England, having fallen hopelessly behind Germany in production of aircrafts and submarines, is close to an end. There is not a chance to improve the situation. So the wisest thing is to conclude peace. The conditions would be as follows. England does not create obstacles for the German Reich's activity in Europe. Germany provides full freedom for England in the Royal Imperial Districts. In case England rejects the opportunity, Hitler would feel free to crush the island to hold it after the war as a subordinate state.
Churchill was watching a Marx Brothers comedy when they informed him about the appearance of Hess. As it is known, Churchill watched the movie to the end, even in spite of the breaking news.
Why did the Prime Minister react just like that? Whether he was so overwhelmed that he could not immediately take any decision and continued watching his film, or alternatively, managed to bear down an explosion of emotions as a true gentleman. Churchill refuses to consider Hess with his peaceful suggestions to be a truce bearer. Arrested the same day, the latter becomes imprisoned until the end of his life. During the war, Hess is being kept at the London Tower, and afterwards at the Berlin Spandau. To understand what could have led Hess to such a tragic end, let us return for a while to a May day of 1920. There, in a Munich smoke-filled cheap bar, Sterneckerbrau, dismissed Army officer Rudolf Hess met a previously unknown speaker of the German Labor Party. That evening, the whole life of Hess was drastically changed. The orator spoke enthusiastically about issues important for Hess, as well, talking of betraying people, saying that it were the Jews to be guilty in everything. In the end of the speech, the small public of the bar arranged an ovation. Little by little, the love of Hess for Hitler turned into a kind of personal dependence. It is worth noting that, in the evidence of people close to Hess, he did anything for Hitler, even in case the natural feelings of decency and honor had been against.
After 20 years of acquaintance with Hess, the members of my family considered him absolutely honest and devoted to Hitler. Hess adored everything Hitler did, trying to protect him from any harm. There is a number of my grandfather's remarks where he mentions an absolute servility of Hess in relations with Hitler.
Гесс был секретарем
In early 20s, in the days of Hitler's imprisonment in Landsberg, Hess had been his personal assistant.
во время заключения Гитлера в Ландсберге.
It was Hess who wrote down the book, My Struggle, while Hitler had been dictating it, several parts of the book, not less.
Во всяком случае, некоторые
Hess influenced a lot at forming the Führer cult of personality in the party.
личности фюрера в партии.
Hitler is Germany. Germany is Hitler. Thus, the most devoted friend of Adolf Hitler was in Churchill's hands, the one who participated in the Mein Kampf writing. It was Hess who introduced the word Führer into rotation, making every anti-fascist shudder, and formulated the goals and tasks of the National People's Society in July 1921. It was Hess to whom Hitler granted the right to assume decisions on all party questions in 1933. All military actions of Germany were prepared with a direct participation of Hess. and it was Hess to affirm the law depriving the Jews of voting rights. In 1939, Hitler named Rudolf Hess his successor, making the central figure of his nearest environment. In the Second World War history, there are just a few events creating background for such a big number of suppositions. So, who was he, Rudolf Hess? A truce bearer or a betrayer? In fact, it was Göring to be the first to propose a private visit to the British Islands in 1939 in order to clear up the situation. Practically on the eve of the declaration of war to Germany by Great Britain, this is senseless. But if you can, have a try, Hitler said. Göring postponed his flight for a while, for at that time the situation in the world had been too complicated. The European powers were unable to come to an agreement then.
The spring of 1941 was the period of paradoxical situation in the world, mostly in Europe, when no one country participating in the war had an idea of what exactly to do and what to expect in the future. No one planned ahead, even for the closest period of 2 to 3 months. Even plans for military actions were absent because no one knew how the war is, what to expect. Nobody had clear predictions. The British situation had been extremely uneasy. Practically, the country was alone to carry on war with Germany. The Americans kept distance. The Soviet Union had not been invaded as yet. It was very hard for Great Britain. As for the Germans, they were not anxious to be at war with the Brits. Simply, Great Britain kept the given word and declared the war on Germany after its invasion of Poland.
To the history of negotiations. In Moscow on the 21st of August, 1939, there was the last session held with participation of Soviet, British, and French military delegations. The main goal of the talks, creation of anti-Hitler coalition, had not been achieved. Great Britain supported Poland, not wanting any concessions with the Soviets. In the evening, Stalin diametrically changed his plans. Stalin decides to conclude a peaceful treaty with Hitler. He sends him a telegram containing agreement to accept Minister of Foreign Affairs Ribbentrop. Having arrived to Moscow, the latter puts his signature under the well-known Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the treaty of non-aggression between the Third German Reich and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. According to the secret protocols attached, the Soviet Russia obtains a part of eastern Poland. The official visit of Göring to Poland is cancelled. But 20 months later, unexpectedly for everyone, Hess departs for England.
That flight occurred right in time for Churchill, who realized that the Germans had been again searing for allies in the West to act jointly against the Soviet Union. There are documents indicating that Churchill, via the British ambassador in Moscow, tried to make Stalin suspicious towards Hitler, and the flight of Hess confirmed that Hitler was capable to accomplish a double dealing.
From the memories of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who happened to be by the side of Hitler exactly when the latter was informed about the escape of his vice, Hess must have gone mad. Hitler said, "It should be something wrong with his brains. It is quite obvious from the letter he left for me as if written by someone else." There, he informs, he departs for England to stop the war using his acquaintances with influential Englishmen. But what acquaintances could have helped Hess to conclude a peaceful treaty? There were two men closely familiar with Hess to provide the required acquaintances for him, namely Dr. Karl Haushofer and his son Albert, the ones who were in friendly relations with Lord Hamilton, being aware of his relationship with the British opposition and sympathy to Nazi Germany. In 1920, pilot Lieutenant Rudolf Hess, demobilized after the First World War, became a student of the Munich University. There, student Hess writes a work under the title of "Big Problems Are Always Solved by Blood and Iron," asserting that national unity can be revived only under the rule of a people's leader, never afraid of a bloodshed in case of necessity. Approved by professorate and students, the work obtained a university reward. Karl Haushofer, the teacher of Hess, was among those who noted the outstanding student. In addition to his higher school course of geopolitics, Haushofer proved to be an expert of Eastern philosophy, mysticism, and theosophy.
I would say I am delighted by the career he made. Being initially an officer of the Bavarian army, later on he defended his PhD to become a professor of the Munich University.
Стать профессором Мюнхенского университета.
It is really surprising that a man made two big careers in a life.
Две таких больших карьеры.
For 200 years, the Haushofer's family had been busy exclusively with natural science without any interest to esoteric.
Никакой эзотерики.
Only when my grandfather was in Japan in 1908, he studied Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, for he lived there. Karl was not occupied by esoteric. Albert, well, he dealt with astrology.
Nevertheless, it is assumed that in Tibet, in the year of 1905, Haushofer met with well-known Russian esoteric specialist Georgy Gurdjieff, magician mastering hypnosis, member of boards of almost all closed organizations. There is the curious evidence indicating that Georgy Gurdjieff and Soso Dzhugashvili, Stalin, had graduated from the same spiritual seminary, and that they met afterwards. According to a theory of Great Mishtagog, the Leo destination is to conduct herds. In Germany, Dr. Haushofer publishes a periodical presenting his own conception of the blood and the soil, in which he asserts the necessity of policy of the living space expansion due to an occupation of the countries of a lower development stage.
I would say it is worth considering Haushofer was not an ideologist, but pragmatic and specialist in geopolitics. That is why he did not influence the Nazi ideology a lot. The matter is that many people there advanced the idea of a space for life, approving it more emotionally, like, for example, the writer Hans Grimm in the popular books by the title People Without Space, written in 1927. Being pragmatic, Haushofer really considered bringing all ethnic Germans together within the same German United State, a vital necessity, so Haushofer supported Hitler while the latter had been completing this program.
Learning about the myth of Hyperborean and the Aryans and getting acquainted with the Lebensraum theory, student Hess realized he found eventually his spiritual father.
Their friendship started in 1920. He came into our family through the adjutant of my grandfather. According to the stories, Rudolf Hess became a real friend to the family, practically a foster child for my grandfather. My father, Albert, and Hess had not a very good relationship, but for my grandfather, Hess was like a stepson. A real male friendship connected them.
As it is known, by that time, Hess became a member of the Tula Society, interacting with the Golden Dawn of External World, British Masonic Lodge, and the High Brotherhood of Light, secret association founded by influential British occultist, magician, and spy Aleister Crowley, who used to say he had been the Hitler predecessor. Perhaps Hess planned to meet these very people in Great Britain who were sympathizing with Nazism, for he had hoped at least to be heard. As for the Premier Churchill's government, Hess was aware that it would have been extremely uneasy to arrive at any agreement with its members, and that he was to find a possibility to talk to its opposition. I would remind that after his parachute landing, Hess asked a British farmer of the Hamiltons' estate. That means he knew the address. During his first meeting with Lord Hamilton, Hess demands the negotiations without participation of official British powers, intending to talk for peace not with the Prime Minister, but with the members of the royal family. Perhaps Hess wanted to talk to the Duke of Windsor, the former British King Edward VIII, abdicated romantically in the favor of love. The Duke dreamt of becoming a king again, sharing absolutely the Hitler's conception of higher races, disposed in the book of Mein Kampf. By the way, it was written there that the Germans and the Brits had been relatives. Maybe Hess wanted to talk to him about the alliance.
In the
system of race privileges, they marked the Swedes, the Normans, the Norwegians, the Baltic peoples as closer to Germany. The Russians and the Poles were to be eliminated as defective. As for the Brits, they were lower than the Germans but higher than the Frenchmen, or say the Romanians. Thus Hitler had certain sympathy to Great Britain, and he mentioned it several times.
As it is known in 1936, the Duke of Windsor and his wife, Mrs. Simpson, visited Germany, and Hitler could have suggested the Duke to support him as regent after forthcoming invasion of Great Britain. Walter Schellenberg, head of the Nazi intelligence, confirms that 5 million of Swiss francs were delivered to the future royal family for these purposes. Hess was aware of existing true friends of Germany and Great Britain, such as member of the National Party of Scotland, Sir Douglas Hamilton, who supported the idea of independence from Great Britain. Being confident of the opposition of Sir Douglas to the acting British government, Karl Haushofer provided Hess with his data.
Hess had a recommending letter available from my uncle to his friend, Lord Hamilton, whom my uncle Albrecht had met at the Berlin Olympic Games of 1936. As it is already known, Hamilton never received any letters from my uncle, for they had been intercepted. So Hess departed in spite of the fact that there were no answers from Hamilton. In this regard, both my uncle and grandfather considered the flight of Hess a big mistake.
Hamilton preferred to pretend he never knew Haushofer and never met Hess, asking to help him get rid of negotiations with an unknown pilot. In a couple of days, the BBC radio translated a joke that there were no more Reichsministers on the territory of Great Britain that day. The joke was conceived a jeer in Berlin. Hitler realized it was best to consider Hess having gone mad. Thus, he signed an address to the party and people of Germany, where he declared his vice insane. Goebbels, head of Nazi propaganda, announced the address via radio. All friends and collaborators refused Hess. Martin Bormann, whom Hess had supported a lot in his career, from an ordinary fighter up to assistant of Hitler, even renamed 2 of his children, named initially in the honor of Hess and his wife Ilse, in Herbert and Ike. Bormann kept saying that neither he nor Hitler could ever expect from Hess such a treachery. Was it possible? Could Hitler's closest ally and his closest friend since the 20s betray him? Loyal, faithful Rudy, who loved him devotedly and always implemented the favorite aphorism of the Führer: party means order.
Höre Adolf Hitler
We trust in Führer, called from above to create the fate of Germany. Hess used to repeat at meetings and in newspapers. And such a man idolizing Hitler could become a traitor. Sounds doubtful, if only not to consider the decision of Hess to depart to England without sanction. But regarding the coming invasion of the Soviet Union, what if the flight had been planned together with Führer in order not to be in war on two fronts?
Мы можем с уверенностью сказать, что Гитлер наверняка ничего не...
We feel confident Hitler knew nothing about the flight. Many documents confirm it. For instance, Goebbels in his memories mentions Hitler in despair, calling that foolish action of Hess terrible.
Это глупая выходка Гесса.
Hitler simply had to declare Hess insane.
Гитлер был вынужден практически сразу после этого объявить Гесса
For the
сумасшедшим.
Third Reich, it was a heavy propaganda defeat, and of course, Hitler was capable to predict the reaction and consequences.
Будет реакция и какие будут последствия.
Ясно, что это было с ведома Гитлера.
It's quite obvious Hitler was aware of everything. For a departure from Germany without previous agreement on that was practically impossible. After all, a personality of the level of Hess should have been being looked after. All this should have been understood as the proposal of neutrality, or even creating a union against the USSR.
Analyzing all this, one comes to the conclusion that Hitler had nothing in common, neither with preparation nor implementation of the flight.
Первое. Если бы Гитлер знал о намерениях своих...
Firstly, if Hitler only knew the ideas of his vice, the latter would have departed not from an airport located by the city of Augsburg, but from somewhere by the Atlantic Ocean.
Куда он мог бы вернуться? Второе. Перелет Гесса был опасен.
Secondly, 6 weeks before the war with the USSR, the flight of Hess could have become a high-class propaganda object for the Brits.
Классным объектом пропаганды.
Известно, что Гесс перед полетом
As it is known, Hess wrote a letter for Hitler, and that the latter did receive it.
Гитлеру, и он это письмо доставил. Значит, слуга
The
говорит,
guy that delivered the note mentioned Hitler's surprising calmness. Hitler only said it was a very dangerous action.
чрезвычайно опасный поступок. Присутствовал
An aide-de-camp of Hermann Göring, who was there, described it a bit differently.
который сказал несколько
As to him, Hitler played a shock and astonishment. It was an example of the play of a brilliant actor.
шок, большое удивление, но именно разыграл. Как он сказал, это было образцом прекрасной актерской игры.
So was it a decision of Hess to depart for Great Britain in his Messerschmitt? It is only known that on the 5th of May, 1941, there had been the last meeting between Hess and Hitler arranged. The meeting was held at the Reichssecretariat and lasted about 4 hours. As the assistant of Hitler pointed out, the voices there sounded extremely excited. When the conversation was over, Hitler put his hand on the shoulder of his vice, saying, "Hess, you have always been absolutely stubborn." There is another confirmation. On the 10th of May, the day of the flight of Hess, the bombing aviation of Germany ruined London after a break in the air raids lasted for several months. A few days later, in Germany, there had been found the ones guilty in the situation with Hess. These were the astrologers, whose opinions always considered guidance for action. In addition to an astrology component, there is another one curious version. In the 40s, energetic young officer Ian Fleming, the one who became famous later on as the author of James Bond, Agent 007, worked in the service of military and naval intelligence of Great Britain. His collaborators knew him as the author of extraordinary but surprisingly successful ideas. Having collected information, Fleming learnt about fanatic belief of Hess in astrology carrying out significant decisions in accordance with the stars.
Сэр Ян Флеминг утверждал, что британские...
Sir Ian Fleming confirmed that the British Special Services worked systematically with permanent contacts of Hess from
которыми общался Гесс.
occult circles of Munich in Switzerland, thus providing Hess with a horoscope permitting him his flight to England.
Решающий ему перелет из Германии в Англию.
Considering that, Hess was a subject for the British intelligence. In case it is really so, his appearance was no secret at all for Churchill. Churchill could unhurriedly watch his movie after the interruption, but not everyone was so easy. In every Nazi memoir of that time, one would read that since the moment of acquaintance and days of joint imprisonment at Landsberg after the defeat of the Putsch of 1923, Hess adored Hitler. Hess mentioned the dear name of Hitler, even writing letters to his bride. The letters are full of love.
Насколько я знаю, на деле
As far as I know, the KGB file of Hess is provided with the mark of Black Bertha. That's the way Hess was called in Munich and Berlin homosexual circles.
Британские психиатры, которые
According to the expertise of the British specialists in psychiatry, Hess had homosexual relations with Hitler since their imprisonment of 1923 at Landsberg.
в тюрьме Ландсберг.
They asserted that not only the ideology, but also their homosexual relationship was the basis of his attachment to the Führer.
This statement may be confirmed by the fact that Hess was moved to the background by Bormann, Goering, and Himmler by 1941. Being deeply unhappy by that, Hess decided to carry out such a theatrical and irresponsible action in a hope to return his beloved Führer. In his last word before the Nuremberg trials, Hess again spoke of his love for Hitler. Not being aware that 4 years before, Hitler had ordered a group of SS parachutists to eliminate Hess. But luckily for the latter, the parachute jumpers had been eliminated themselves. According to a stenogram of the Nuremberg trials, Hess intended to describe his British mission within one of the sessions, but hardly having pronounced in spring of 1941, he was interrupted by the chairman of the trials, Lawrence, a Brit. After that incident, Hess refused to give answers to the judges, pretending to lose memory. What was he going to say? And why was he interrupted?
Я считаю, что тема Гесса, конечно, была для англичан...
I consider the Hess topic too critical for the Brits. That is why a number of documents related to the flight is still secret.
Любопытный эпизод, когда...
Just an example. Within the September negotiations, where Stalin and Beaverbrook took part, and how is Hess over there? Stalin asked all of a sudden.
А как поживает
Beaverbrook even had no chance to avoid answering he met Hess after the beginning of the war.
Встречался, и встречался уже после начала войны. Гесс, конечно...
For the Brits, Hess surely was of the fallback position to be moved forward to negotiate.
Продержалась от 3 недель до 3 месяцев. In
that case, Soviet held out for 3 months instead of 3 weeks under Nazi Germany, but not before the collapse of Soviet Union.
In 1958, the Western Allies decided to address through the USSR with the inquiry of releasing Hess.
Нужно обратиться к СССР с соответствующим запросом.
But while been asked by the Brits whether he should take the initiative on that, Chancellor Adenauer refused the honor, for in his opinion, releasing the last Spandau prisoner was neither in his personal interest nor the interest of the German public.
Adenauer сказал, что это не в его интересах.
There were still Frank, Steyr, Chirac, and Hess kept at Spandau.
Добиваться освобождения последних заключенных Шпандау. Это были фунты.
So, the Brits said they were not ready to be occupied with the Hess matter themselves, while there was no interest in the matter from the side of the German government.
Правительство в этом не заинтересовано, то они не будут этим заниматься.
At Spandau, where Nazi prisoners were captured for different periods of time, Hess was a stranger among his own men. The prisoners tried not to deal with him, and so did Hess. The first several years of his imprisonment he spent sitting in his cell without any physical training or any visits to the church, complaining all the time for a bad state of health. Nobody came to visit him, and he asked for nobody. He tried to kill himself at least 3 times. Terribly afraid of being poisoned, he closed glasses of water by paper sheets and fastened them by threads. As for the Brits, who watched the prison in turn with representatives of other states' winners, Hess was afraid of them.
As I remember, they had said that Hess was not treated fairly at the British prison. There could have even been some violence. It all influenced his behavior, especially considering him being hysteric to a certain extent.
Later on, having been left alone, Hess felt an interest to life. And it is worth noting that the attitude of Hess from the side of the Spandau administration had been more than surprising. Looking through the stories of keeping big prisoners of the 20th century, one would hardly find an attitude to a prisoner of the kind.
В его день рождения и на Рождество он требовал виноград, не нравится.
On the day of his birthday, or so, on Christmas, Hess used to demand grapes and other nice things.
Я сам не был свидетелем, но
And sometimes, according to the words of the American director, even frequently, a plane had been inspecting Europe, searching for foodstuffs Hess asked for. To me, for instance, Hess complained that they did not bring him the red Russian caviar he ordered.
Красную икру, которую я очень хочу, вот мне нравится, но ни разу еще не подавали, то есть не дают. А я ему говорю, вы знаете, у вас же заболевание.
Well, I was trying to explain salty caviar was not good for his stomach, asking to excuse me for keeping him on the diet in his own interests.
Со мной согласитесь, что я вам прописать такое вот, что может вызвать обострение, такое я не мог. И поэтому вы нас уж извините, мы стараемся следить за той диетой, которую вам как бы по диагнозу можно или нельзя.
According to evidences, Hess was not broken neither normally nor physically, having spent at the British prisons and at Spandau 46 years. He still hoped to be released. Everything even seemed to be in his favor, for there emerged information in the press that the Soviet side was ready to examine his matter.
Academician Sakharov, a good friend of mine, wrote in one of his articles that it was high time to solve the problem of poor Hess. The Soviet press attacked Sakharov for his protection of the military criminal. I also asked the academician about his reasons for doing that. Sakharov answered that he simply felt sorry for Hess, a helpless old man sitting in prison guarded by 4 states. A senseless situation. It is necessary to release him.
At 6:35 p.m. on the 17th of August, 1987, a telephone call in the house of Wolf Rudiger, the son of Hess. The Spandau administration informed him about the death of his father. Officially, prisoner number 7, 93-year-old Rudolf Hess, killed himself. Having been left alone in a garden house inside the yard for a few minutes, the prisoner tied one end of the flexible cord of an electric lamp up to the window, another one wrapped tightly around his neck, and threw himself down to the earth. A death from self-hanging. Dr. Zagel, the lawyer of Hess, was the first to reject that official version, saying Hess simply had no physical ability to implement a suicide that way, for the old man could neither lift his hands higher than his head to put his sweater on, nor tie his shoestrings together.
I also have certain doubts that Hess could have killed himself.
Мог покончить жизнь самоубийством. Ну вот, скажем, такие факты. Гесс утром просыпается, просит своего слугу.
For instance, that morning Hess asked his servant to purchase some things for him in the city, a new kettle and other stuff.
Ну и прочие какие-то вот такие бытовые мелочи. Это, с точки зрения психологии, может быть, не очень.
Strange for a man planning suicide.
Который собирается совершить такой поступок, как самоубийство.
Я хорошо знаю этот домик. неоднократно.
I knew this garden party well. I checked it several times. It would be impossible to reach that electric cord, which Hess used to kill himself according to official sources.
Повесился якобы, чтобы его сорвать.
Nobody could reach it. Not even a 2-meter-high person could.
Не прыгая, никто не мог. Двухметровый дядя.
How could he only hang himself?
Как он мог повеситься, непонятно.
The declaration of the son of Hess caused a scandal. They started investigation and learned that on the day of the death, no one let the nurse of Hess in. Having forced his way to the garden house, the nurse saw a lifeless body and 2 strangers above. One of them began artificial respiration to Hess and tried so hard that he broke 9 ribs and tore several internal organs. On August 24th, they ruined the prison Spandau to ashes and burnt the garden house. Who really needed it? Wolf Rudiger was confident these were the British Special Services. At the repeated inspection of the body at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Munich, it was established that Rudolf Hess had been suffocated twice. So what? He had thrown himself from the chair 2 times? So it was a murder. If only my father was released from the prison, the Brits, I put it mildly, would get some problems. For he was not going to keep silent. Wolf Rudiger asserted. Hess said to one of his guards that, having left Spandau, he would soon make a statement to make the whole world shudder. After the information obtained, the official version of suicide became too weak. Then the Attorney General of Great Britain ordered to stop the investigation without explanation of reasons. But what was the reason for such a strange solution? As it is known, under the public pressure, Churchill had prepared a public report, the goals of Hess's flight to speak before the British Parliament, by the end of May 1941. But the speech did not come into being. The text of the report was eventually sent to the archives. Recently, in the open part of the archive, there was found a curious note written by the Churchill's hand. The note informs that Hess made also some other declarations, but it would be out of the public interest to reveal them. Was it the reason of interrupting Hess at the Nuremberg trials, and who shut his mouth 46 years later before he managed to make another attempt to talk? Full archives of the Hess story are to be published in Great Britain only in 2017, and it is doubtful that until then there is hope for us to obtain a fuller truth on this matter. But one issue might be confirmed for sure even now. Great Britain did not accept the proposition of Hitler made via his closest friend, Rudolf Hess. If it only happened differently, the contemporary map of the world could have been mostly of black color.
From 1937 till 1941, this room had been the office of Rudolf Hess. Later on, the one of Martin Bormann.
Потом Мартина Бормана.
Rudolf Hess directed the party activity right from here.
С 1900
From 1957, the Higher Music School of Munich is located here.
Высшее музыкальное училище.
I consider it a better usage of this place.